Everyone knows the broad strokes of D-Day. What you might not know are the famous people who stormed the beach, the fates of the people who died there, or the mysteries about the landing that still don't quite have answers.
Why exactly was it called D-Day? Did a soldier actually walk around Normandy Beach playing the bagpipes? Just because the legendary military operation went according to plan doesn't mean there aren't a whole lot of unanswered questions. D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history, was the result of years of planning, reconnaissance, international cooperation, and a complicated web of intentional miscommunications and double-agent activity meant to confuse the Germans. And it all worked. Despite heavy casualties, the Allies won the day, and that victory led to the defeat of Nazi Germany and the other Axis powers. But the human cost was steep. We don't actually know how many people died that day. Some put the Allied deaths as low as 5,000, while others have it as high as 12,000. Most modern memorials list 4,414 Allied deaths, while at least as many Germans perished. No matter how much planning was done beforehand, the act of landing hundreds of thousands of soldiers on multiple beaches inevitably produced a deadly mass of confusion.
American troops caught between the sea and experienced Wehrmacht fighters are sitting ducks.
And while a valiant attempt was made to recover and record the remains of Allied soldiers in the battle's aftermath, some remains likely washed out to sea, leaving no trace. For obvious reasons, record-keeping wasn't at the top of anyone's mind in that moment. The Allied priority was to move inland and take German positions, while every soldier on both sides was fighting to stay alive. But the effort goes on today. Even 80 years later, there are organizations out there dedicated to recovering the remains of the missing and bringing them home to their families. One of the more ingenious Allied strategies in the lead-up to the D-Day invasion was called Operation Fortitude, and you probably didn't hear about it in history class. It involved large inflatable tanks, actually balloons, that were deployed to trick German forces into thinking the invasion they knew was coming was happening anywhere but Normandy. But a few blow-up tanks wouldn't have been enough to fool the Germans. Fortitude worked on many levels. Radio operators put out false communications, while spies created fake underground chatter about the coming invasion. And Calais. Inoperable aircraft were staged at various locations, as were landing craft made from heavy-duty fabric and wood. It was true wartime theater, and it was all set up as the 1st U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. Of course, FUSAG didn't exist, but its commander, General George S. Patton, absolutely did. And Patton gamely showed up at dummy locations to deliver speeches and inspect what amounted to stage sets. It may well be that Patton's participation was the thing that convinced Germany FUSAG was real. After all, why would the US send one of its top generals north if a Calais invasion wasn't imminent? The ruse proved so effective that even after the D-Day invasion began in Normandy, Germany's 15th Army remained ready and waiting in Calais for a second invasion that never came. On the morning of D-Day, as thousands fought in Normandy, Hitler was sound asleep at his home in the Bavarian Alps. Even when news of the invasion reached Hitler's staff, they didn't wake him up. They'd been told to let him sleep, and nobody had the nerve to defy the order. When Hitler finally got up at around noon, he dragged his feet, assuming the invasion was a low-level distraction effort on the part of the Allies. It took hours and repeated urgent requests by his forces on the ground in Normandy before he agreed to redirect troops and weapons to defend the beaches. If he'd been awakened earlier by some brave aide, could Hitler have changed the course of that day? It's hard to tell, but he hadn't exactly distinguished himself as a military leader. He and his commanders had been fooled by Operation Fortitude, mustering forces in the wrong location. And when Field Marshal Erwin Rommel urged Hitler to boost defenses along the Normandy coast, Hitler told him to keep the deadly panzer tank divisions inland. It's possible Hitler was just as effective a commander asleep as he was awake, but thankfully for the Allies, we'll never know. It's hard to overstate the importance of Juan Pujol Garcia's work during the war. The Spanish businessman was no fan of dictators, not Francisco Franco, and certainly not Hitler. As World War II became a reality in Europe, he offered his services to Britain as a double agent, but was turned down due to inexperience. Not to be deterred, Pujol went freelance. At first, he positioned himself as a fanatical pro-Nazi official employed by the Spanish government. The Germans then recruited him, ordering him to move to England to build a pro-Nazi network of agents. Instead, Pujol went to Lisbon and got to work. He would send fake reports to his Nazi contacts, sprinkling them with legitimate facts to make his lies more believable. In 1942, Pujol approached Britain's MI5 again, revealing himself to be the secret agent codenamed Garbo, who'd caught their attention even while remaining unidentified. This time, they brought him on.
The other day I was offered money. to get information.
What sort of information?
Secret information.
As for his connection to D-Day, Pujol was a major part to the Allied victory. He once again set about lying to Nazi officials, insisting that rumblings about a Normandy invasion were nonsense. Then, very shortly before the actual landing, he leaked info to the Germans about Normandy. Too late, of course. Still, the intelligence was technically correct, which bolstered his authenticity as a German spy. After the war, Pujol remained an MI5 agent, helping to suppress a post-war Nazi revival. Eventually, he faked his own death to avoid Nazi revenge. He told his handler to inform everyone he died of malaria and then moved to Venezuela. This was so believable that most people, including Pujol's own family, believed he was dead until the 1980s. He died in 1988. Anyone who isn't hip to the jargon of military communiques may be wondering why we still call it D-Day when it happened in France on a Tuesday in June, some 80 years ago. It's because the D in D-Day refers to, well, day. More specifically, it was common in the Army to use the term D-Day for the first day of a given operation. In the similar vein, H-hour stands for the hour in which a given operation is set to begin. A simple system of pluses and minuses denotes days before or after a military action. For example, D+2 referred to June 8th, 2 days after the June 6th landings. There's actually a method to this rather vague standard. For one, being less specific allowed military commanders to be flexible with the dates in case the weather or something else changed the timeline. Furthermore, if there was a leak, enemy forces wouldn't necessarily be able to figure out what was going on because D-Day -2 was intentionally vague. As to why we still call it D-Day and not the Battle of Normandy or something else? Absolutely no idea. The heavy equipment the Allies needed to land on Normandy beaches and move inland would have been a disaster on soft or boggy ground. For Allied commanders, the years-long process of planning D-Day therefore included sending out soil samplers. Yet for all their vital work, which required nerves of steel, these collectors are rarely mentioned. These men would approach French beaches as silently as possible, using small craft, sometimes even miniature submarines, then either swim or canoe to the shoreline. Once there, they would dig up sand and soil samples and tuck them away in a jar or bag before returning quietly to the ocean. Often, these missions would take place under cover of darkness, and of course, a variety of beaches were sampled with the assumption that German forces would notice and not be able to determine exactly where the invasion would begin. These intrepid scientists took other key measurements, including water depth and the way currents moved into and around the beach.
We need waves that are less than 5 feet. We're going to land at dawn. We'd like to have a half a moon. We'd like to have 2,500 feet of cloud ceiling.
The scientists' information was so important that it convinced Eisenhower to focus on Normandy, where more compact sand gave forces the best chance. Their intel also influenced some landing parties to include bobbin tanks that laid down steel mesh, which allowed other vehicles to follow behind without sinking. The soil samplers played such a vital role in the invasion, it seems unfair they're not at least mentioned in history books. Although Field Marshal Rommel earned the grudging admiration of Winston Churchill and the nickname of the Desert Fox, his actual wartime record isn't very impressive. Among the many mysteries about D-Day is the question of how Rommel earned such a lofty reputation when he was caught totally flat-footed. In 1943, Rommel was given command of the German defense of Normandy. He directed personnel to plant landmines, build weapons platforms, thread terrain with barbed wire, and flood marshy areas to slow an Allied advance. He failed, however, to convince Hitler to send panzer tank divisions to the region, which may have been a fatal error, but it wasn't all Hitler's fault. Rommel made some strange decisions, too, especially considering the abundance of evidence that Allied forces were planning to invade somewhere in the region. But just 2 days before D-Day, or D-2, he left the front to celebrate his wife's birthday. Her gift that year? A nice pair of shoes.
He had believed too much in the German weather forecast, which had said on the 6th of June it will be poor weather.
By the time he made it back to the front, D-Day was effectively over and the war had begun its turn in the Allies' favor. Bagpipes aren't a subtle instrument. They're loud and they command attention. So why did one ballsy bagpiper play the pipes on Sword Beach while British troops advanced? And how the heck did he manage to survive?
Well, everybody else had guns in their hands, and you had your bagpipes.
The piper in question was Bill Millen, a Scottish private then serving in the British 1st Special Service Brigade. Before his group was about to land, Millen's commanding officer had an idea that was both highly traditional and exceedingly unusual. That officer, Brigadier Simon Fraser, 15th Lord Lovett, was both a hereditary Scottish aristocrat and someone Hitler allegedly regarded as a terrorist. Fraser, seeing Millen in his kilt, suggested he break out the bagpipes. Millen noted that music making was technically banned, as it obviously attracted enemy fire. Fraser's reported response was that, as the rule came from the English War Office and they were Scottish, they could disregard the order. So Millen went ahead, walking back and forth on a Normandy beach, taking fire and playing the bagpipes, all to raise morale. He also took on the traditional role of leading his group across a bridge. 12 soldiers were killed in that action. Later, Millen had a chance to talk to 2 captured German snipers from that day.
We asked them why they didn't shoot at the piper walking in the front, and one of them said, because we thought he was doomcuff, he was mad.
Dig deep enough into the story of D-Day, and you may come across Yang Kyung-jong. As it's typically told, Yang was a young Korean man who was conscripted into the Japanese army in the late 1930s. He was captured by Russia, then conscripted into that nation's service in 1942. Captured in Ukraine, Yang was then forced into the German army and sent to Normandy, where he was yet again captured, this time by Allies on D-Day. Transported to a POW camp in the US, he eventually became a US citizen and died in Illinois in 1992. His story has understandably captivated everyone, from action filmmakers to noted historians. Yang might be one of history's most unlucky people, if only he was real. If you take a more careful second look, his story quickly becomes hard to confirm. A photo that allegedly shows a war-weary Yang in German uniform doesn't use his name. Instead, its official entry in the National Archives only identifies him as a young Japanese man. Indeed, there's practically no documentation of a Korean man passed from army to army in the midst of this massive global war. There were Korean people who lived in Berlin under Nazi rule, but most appear to have returned to Korea by 1945. People of Asian descent fought at D-Day, including the unnamed Japanese man in a German uniform, and on the Allied side, multiple Chinese-American service members who stormed the beaches that day. But as far as Yang goes, he may make a great story, but he's as fake as a balloon pretending to be a tank. A world war sweeps all sorts of people into the fighting, major and minor celebrities among them, so it may come as no surprise that there are more than a few names you might recognize who saw action on D-Day, from athletes to silver screen legends to Hollywood directors and even a famous novelist. Let's take a look at some of the celebrities who stormed the beaches on June 6, 1944.
I can't change the laws of physics. Got to have 30 minutes.
James Doohan, Star Trek's original and iconic Scotty, joined the Canadian Army in 1938 and saw action fighting for the Allies in World War II. You probably knew this, but yes, Scotty was Canadian. Explains the accent, right? On D-Day, Doohan was part of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. They landed at Juno Beach, one of the most heavily guarded of the 5 landing points. On his way up the beach, Doohan unwittingly ran over anti-tank mines, which thankfully didn't go off. He killed 2 German snipers and safely reached cover in the initial assault, but later that night, a fellow Canadian mistook him for a German in the darkness and shot him 6 times. Doohan lost his right middle finger. During a 1998 interview with the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, Doohan compared his D-Day experience with the famous opening scene from Saving Private Ryan, which depicted the landings at Omaha Beach that same morning. After Doohan recovered from his wounds, he returned to duty and served for the remainder of the war. Even if you don't know baseball, you know Yogi Berra, famous for his quotable lines like, "Nobody goes there anymore, it's too crowded." He could have thought the same thing when he fought the Nazis at Normandy. Berra was just 18 and playing for a minor league Yankees team in Virginia when he joined the US Navy. He was almost immediately shipped out to boot camp, where he was trained for the D-Day operation. Berra watched the first assault from the water, where he was a machine gunner on a rocket boat. In his autobiography, It Ain't Over, he wrote, "It was like the 4th of July. It was like the Statue of Liberty fireworks, except not in color."
We were the first ones in before the army come in. It's amazing what that little boat could do, though.
Eventually, Berra got close enough to the shore to start firing. Amid the chaos, he and his crewmates shot down an American aircraft flying support for the ground troops, thinking it was a German plane. Luckily, the pilot was able to escape and land safely, and Berra escaped D-Day unscathed. A few years later, he was at Yankee Stadium on his way to becoming a baseball legend. David Niven was already a famous Hollywood actor by 1939. He was nearly finished filming the movie Raffles when Germany invaded Poland that September. Niven didn't waste any time. He joined the British Army as soon as the film wrapped. He continued acting during his military service, and coincidentally, as Allies were storming the beaches on June 6, 1944, Niven's film The Way Ahead was being released in London. As fans watched him play a lieutenant on screen, Lieutenant Colonel Niven joined the fighting in Normandy just days after the initial invasion. In his autobiography, David Niven, The Moon's a Balloon, he claimed to have landed under fire at Omaha Beach, but other sources reported that he arrived at Normandy via airplane as part of a BBC contingent. Niven also recalled hiding in a foxhole while fighting at Carentan and being given the Iron Cross by a friend. After D-Day, Niven continued to fight, though he also made frequent trips back to England from the front. Battling nerves and a severe case of seasickness, 21-year-old Private Charles Durning, who'd been drafted the year before, was one of more than 132,000 young men who stormed the Normandy beaches on D-Day.
It was scary. You're not thinking about anything, you're just thinking about, you hope that shell that just went off isn't going to hit this boat.
Durning was one of the first 3 men off his boat when the ramp went down, and he watched in horror as the man in front of him was immediately shot and killed. Struggling in deep water, Durning saw bullets whizzing by him as he made his way to shore, where he recalled seeing men literally ripped in half by German artillery. He sheltered behind tanks as he made his way up the beach under heavy fire. After the war, Durning became known for his roles in the movies Tootsie, The Sting, and True Confessions, as well as his stage performances in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Still, even decades later, Durning never forgot his service, especially those harrowing days at Normandy. When the 4th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army made their D-Day assault in Utah Beach, a relatively unknown 25-year-old writer named J.D. Salinger was among their ranks. Salinger worked on short stories while training for the invasion, including one that would become his most famous work, The Catcher in the Rye. In April 1944, Salinger participated in a now infamous large-scale rehearsal for the invasion known as Operation Tiger, which resulted in the deaths of nearly 750 Allied soldiers after German torpedo boats attacked them.
They didn't have enough guards out, and some German U-boats saw a target of opportunity.
Salinger was a member of the Army's Counterintelligence Corps, and he was part of either the first or second wave onto the beaches. The Utah beach forces faced light resistance, and Salinger was able to make it ashore with relative ease. But once he got off the beach, the real fighting started, and it was fierce. Salinger and his unit were tasked with liberating the city of Cherbourg, which was critical for the success of the invasion. As a member of the CIC, Salinger was in charge of organizing the interrogation of the hundreds of German POWs. It wasn't until July that he was finally relieved for a few days, after a job well done. By the time he was called up to active duty in September 1941, Oscar-winning director John Ford was already a household name. He was assigned to the Field Photographic Unit, part of the larger Office of Strategic Services, the U.S.'s foremost counterintelligence agency at the time. After serving in the China-Burma-India Theater in 1943, shooting footage for OSS propaganda films, Ford was given a much bigger job in early 1944. The head of the OSS, Wild Bill Donovan, put Ford in charge of Allied photography for the entire D-Day invasion. Ford had already shot the massive Battle of Midway, which had won him another Oscar, and he was there for the D-Day landings at Omaha Beach. During the initial assault, Ford watched from the USS Augusta, but soon got on a PT boat and headed toward the beach. His boat got into a heated machine gun battle with some Germans. Well, at least according to Ford. Many of his biographers think he may have exaggerated that part of the story. Ford spent 5 days filming the invasion, after which news agencies broadcast his footage across the U.S. to keep the public informed about the operation. Brigadier General Theodore Ted Roosevelt Jr. had one of the most outsized reputations of any of the men storming the beaches on D-Day. He was the son of former President Theodore Roosevelt and cousin of current President Franklin D. Roosevelt. But he didn't use his family ties to stay out of the fray. Roosevelt was a soldier through and through, and his conduct on D-Day was nothing short of exemplary. In fact, Roosevelt actually requested to be among the first troops to hit the beaches. He was the highest-ranking military figure to participate in the initial landings, and his bravery earned him widespread accolades from his men. He helped organize and lead the men once they reached the beaches, and his strength and confidence helped inspire troops to press on. It's worth noting he was 56 years old at the time, no spring chicken. In fact, most reports say he was the oldest person to storm the beaches that day. For his effort that day, Roosevelt earned the Congressional Medal of Honor. Unfortunately, he wouldn't live to see the end of the war. He died from a heart attack just over a month later on July 12, 1944. Bobby Jones is the only player to ever achieve golf's mythical Grand Slam, winning all 4 major golf tournaments in a single year, 1930. Already long retired from golf by the time World War II broke out, Jones joined the U.S. Army Air Force in 1942, just after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Jones served as an intelligence officer in the 9th Air Force and trained under General Dwight D. Eisenhower for the D-Day invasion. His unit landed at Normandy under heavy enemy fire on June 7th. After 2 days on the beaches, they moved inland, where, like J.D. Salinger, Jones interrogated German POWs. Jones was promoted to lieutenant colonel and discharged in August 1944. The HBO series Band of Brothers, based on Stephen Ambrose's book, brought widespread attention to the stories of many American heroes from D-Day, among them Major Richard Dick Winters. As a commander of Easy Company, Winters was part of the overnight airborne drops behind German lines. He was the jump master of plane number 67, which was hit with anti-aircraft fire while airborne. Winters escaped, but he lost most of his equipment in the descent, landing near Sainte-Mère-Église armed only with a bayonet.
We're not lost, Private. We're in Normandy.
He quickly began rounding up scattered paratroopers to head towards Sainte-Marie-de-Mont, but on the way they met Germans in a small village and had an intense firefight. The unit managed to take out 4 massive artillery cannons, and Winters killed several Germans, all before noon. For his efforts, Winters was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. For decades, British actor Richard Todd wooed audiences with his vivid portrayals of heroes. Modern crowds might know him best from the 1962 film The Longest Day, but Todd wasn't just an immensely popular and talented actor. He was a paratrooper in the British Army's 7th Parachute Battalion during the real Longest Day. Todd was one of the first troops to land behind enemy lines as part of the massive airdrop effort, and he helped the British secure the Pegasus and Ranville bridges. The bridges were liberated by Major John Howard, the same man Todd would later portray in The Longest Day, and Todd and his unit were called in to reinforce Howard and his men. For several hours, Todd's unit fought the Germans in close combats while being bombarded by artillery and mortar fire. In 2004, Todd traveled back to the Normandy battlefield and found the spot where he landed nearly 6 decades before, although this time he didn't have to jump out of a plane to get there. Of all the veterans who fought on D-Day, future President Dwight D. Eisenhower is probably the most famous, but he might also be the one that makes you say, but was he really there at Normandy? As you well know, as the supreme commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, Eisenhower had begun planning for the Normandy invasion in January 1944. The landings were originally scheduled for June 5th, but bad weather forced Eisenhower to postpone the attack. In order to raise troop morale, Eisenhower distributed his now famous Order of the Day just prior to go time.
You are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you.
As the Allied forces launched the D-Day invasion, Eisenhower was in Portsmouth, England, awaiting news from the front. When news arrived about the tough going at Omaha Beach, he authorized bombing raids to neutralize German forces. The strategy worked. Eisenhower arrived in Normandy on June 7th, giving orders from a warship anchored near Omaha Beach. So it turns out, yes, he was there. He wasn't right there in the bulk of the fighting, but he was also probably a whole lot closer than you imagined. From endless disagreements between Allied forces to a military rehearsal that took a deadly turn, there are plenty of dark facts about D-Day that you were never aware of. The idea of invading France was first considered as early as 1942. The invasion is often portrayed as a triumph of careful planning and incredibly brave soldiers, and it certainly was both of those things. But that overlooks one key fact that also came close to being a horrifying disaster for the Allies. Americans sometimes think that because General Dwight D. Eisenhower was Supreme Commander of the Allied forces, that means America was in charge, but it was a partnership. As history notes, Eisenhower's staff was full of British officers, and the British themselves did much of the planning and logistics work. One of the reasons Eisenhower was chosen for his role was his ability to get combative personalities to work together, but he threatened to quit and throw the whole operation into disarray when the British pushed back on no-brainer plans to bomb the German lines prior to the landings. In fact, as NPR reports, Eisenhower was so painfully aware of how easily it could go wrong, he wrote out a statement to be issued if it went badly. And things did go wrong. Nearly everything, in fact. As engines of our ingenuity notes, the bombs Eisenhower fought for mostly missed their targets. Naval bombardments were ineffective. Amphibious tanks turned out to be not very amphibious at all, and the weather wasn't ideal, scattering Allied forces. The amazing thing about D-Day is that it succeeded at all. Considering what was at stake, you might imagine that the military leaders planning Operation Overlord and the Normandy invasion would want to be solidly in agreement before giving the order. The fact is, they argued over just about every detail right up until the end. History Extra notes that the British and the Americans went back and forth over the details for years. The British even delayed the invasion twice, opting to direct resources to an invasion of northern Africa and later an invasion of Sicily, Operation Torch and Operation Husky, respectively. There were good military reasons for these decisions, but the Americans suspected the British were trying to undermine the Normandy plan. As UVA Today explains, the British thought invading through Normandy would be too difficult and weren't afraid to express this opinion. In the end, the British only agreed because they worried the Americans would go their own way otherwise, but Prime Minister Winston Churchill continued to argue over every detail. History reports this bickering led to incredible chaos right before D-Day. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower actually threatened to resign when Churchill opposed having Allied bombers pulled out of Germany to bombard the defenses in France, which Eisenhower couldn't believe. The threat worked, and the bombers were moved, but it's kind of incredible to think that shortly before the largest amphibious invasion in history, the leadership team was in such a disarray. The Allied forces knew that any attempt to invade Europe by the Normandy beaches would meet stiff resistance. As Time notes, the German army spent more than 3 years and incredible resources building a series of impressive defenses called the Atlantic Wall. The series of bunkers and gun emplacements were just the outer edge of German defenses. They'd been in France for years at this point, and there were real concerns that armored divisions and reinforcements from France's interior would lead to an Allied defeat.
Beyond the formidable sea defenses, an army battle-hardened on the Eastern Front lies in wait.
As a result, a key part of D-Day involved dropping thousands of paratroopers behind enemy lines shortly before the attack. The 101st and 82nd U.S. Airborne Divisions were dropped on the Cherbourg Peninsula in order to secure areas, siege bridges, and other important transportation links, and sabotage the German defenses. It was a disaster. According to history, bad weather led to the paratroopers being dropped wildly off target, leaving them scattered and vulnerable to snipers and easy capture. Only 1/6 of the men actually reached their rally points. In the darkness and chaos, many paratroopers were forced to form ad hoc units on the run. Many drowned when they accidentally landed in flooded ditches or in rivers. The fact that paratroopers still managed to carry out their mission is nothing short of incredible. When we think of D-Day and the Normandy invasion, we think of guns and bullets, tanks and bombers. We think of the high number of casualties and the immense bravery required to step off those landing craft in the face of withering fire. But there was another aspect to the invasion that was just as crucial and just as effective: psychological warfare. As History Today notes, there was literally a psychological warfare division within the supreme headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force. And the British Political Warfare Executive and the United States Office of Strategic Services collaborated on several psychological warfare operations. As noted by author David Welch, one of their main projects was Nachrichten für die Truppe, or News for the Troops. This was a newspaper designed to look like a legitimate news publication that mixed actual news and other stories with blatant propaganda designed to lower German morale. Close to 1 million copies were dropped in France just before the invasion. Smithsonian Magazine notes that the British also broadcast a regular radio program hosted by Gustav Siegfried Eins, who presented himself as a dedicated Nazi who was outraged at the behavior and failings of the Nazi hierarchy. As Coffee or Die notes, the psychological warfare was deemed a success because Nazi officers complained about their effect, and because so many German prisoners of war were found with the newspapers and other leaflets in their pockets. Mainstream history imbues D-Day and Operation Overlord with supreme importance when it comes to ending World War II. The usual narrative is that the Nazis were embedded in Europe, and the only way to end the war was to open up a second front. But as historian William Hitchcock notes, the Allies had been perfectly happy for years to let Russia absorb Nazi aggression on the Eastern Front, though they couldn't say so publicly. As the History News Network argues, the Germans were more or less doomed to lose the war ever since they failed to capture Moscow in the winter of 1941. Which transformed the war from an aggressive invasion to a slow war of attrition.
The Germans kept on fighting when we thought that they shouldn't do.
Put simply, in a grinding war of attrition, the math wasn't on the German side. The Nazis were already in retreat and doomed. In fact, just a few weeks after D-Day, the Soviets and their allies spearheaded an operation on the Eastern Front, Operation Bagration, which involved a staggering 2.3 million men, and saw forces strike the Nazis at the Belarusian front. So, if it wasn't crucial to ending the war, why put so much effort into D-Day? One reason was Allied worries that the Red Army would simply roll over Europe. In fact, this was the stated strategy of the Soviet Politburo in 1944. Operation Overlord was as much about stopping the Russian takeover of Europe as it was the defeat of the Nazis. Operation Overlord and the Normandy invasions Americans refer to as D-Day took years and years of careful planning. So it isn't too surprising to learn that the Allied forces planned a dress rehearsal to test out equipment and training. What might be a little surprising is how disastrous that rehearsal ended up being. As BBC News explains, the operation was codenamed Exercise Tiger. On April 28, 1944, 8 ships designed to convey and land tanks on the beaches of Normandy were sailed with full cargoes to Slapton Sands near Devon, England, where the beach had been fortified similarly to Normandy. The Allies arranged to have live artillery fired near the ships to make the landings as realistic as possible. History reports that 23,000 troops were loaded onto the ships, which headed out to sea, then turned around and returned to stage the practice landing. but the radio chatter attracted German vessels, which launched an attack on the Allied forces. A British destroyer was supposed to have accompanied the ships, but had been ordered elsewhere at the last minute, leaving the tank ships undefended. 3 ships were hit by German torpedoes. When the sailors hit the water, they discovered to their horror that they were wearing their life jackets incorrectly, leading many to die of hypothermia in the frigid water. The disaster cost 800 lives, but the families of the army covered it all up to maintain security. War is ugly and violent, but over the decades, the narrative of D-Day has been established via movies and TV shows to be one of heroism and sacrifice. The soldiers landing on the beach that day are usually depicted as humble men drafted into one of the most important and dangerous invasions, reluctantly practicing violence. The Nazis naturally get a less positive spin. The truth is that there were war crimes on both sides: massacres, sexual assaults, torture, and worse. HistoryNet reports many incidents where Nazi soldiers outright murdered Canadian prisoners of war, including more than 150 who were killed while trying to surrender. After the war, the German officers involved in the incidents were identified, but only one, Kurt Meyer, was tried for war crimes. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but only served 5 years. As the Washington Post notes, the Allies weren't immune from the atrocities. After the Normandy landings, many American troops were accused of sexual assault. General Omar Bradley warned the Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower about looting, pillaging, wanton destruction, rape, and other crimes being committed by Americans. Almost none of these crimes were reported or prosecuted. Allied soldiers landing in Normandy on June 6, 1944 were met with brutal resistance, but their stories didn't end with their deaths. Because surviving troops were busy taking positions along the coast, the dead of D-Day were not always tended to in the moments after their deaths. To be certain, a dedicated group of Graves registration soldiers would address the issue as quickly as they could, but no one expected them to be digging graves under heavy fire during the storming of the beaches. The best that a surviving soldier could do was to cover remains with a blanket or other cloth and move on. Many recalled the harrowing sight of remains floating in the water and fallen on the beach, some places so full of the dead that surviving soldiers had to crawl on top of them. Though many of the military personnel who approached the beaches of Normandy on June 6 did so with the intent to make it to land and push into Europe, some were expected to return to their ships waiting further back in the English Channel. Others remained on those ships to receive returning landing craft, as well as the wounded and dead soldiers who had been put back onto the boats. One, Robert E. Davenport, was a naval intercept officer on the USS Henrico. Davenport told USA Today that when these smaller transports returned, some carried the remains of soldiers who were killed by German guns before they even left the vessel. Other personnel, hampered by a sandbar that forced them to get out early and wade through the heavy surf under heavy fire, were quickly wounded or killed. Some were then pulled back into the craft. Back on the beach, soldiers recalled that bodies also frequently washed back onto the shore, adding to the already staggering number of remains that needed to be recovered and buried in temporary grave sites. As Allied troops successfully took German positions and gained control of the Normandy beaches, they had to move further into France and the rest of Europe. Paratroopers and other airborne forces had already landed further into the continent and would be working to meet them. But behind them, along the coastline, were thousands of bodies. Simply leaving them in the open where they fell was unacceptable, both for the reason of sanitation and morale. But neither did soldiers have the time to establish a formal cemetery for all of the dead. So temporary grave sites were quickly arranged. One man, Sergeant Albert E. Legg, selected one such place. Without many supplies or equipment, he used whatever was available, including sections of wooden boxes to act as grave markers. Legg and his fellow service members used parachutes left behind by paratroopers as shrouds. Another service member, Private Thomas J. Dowling, recalled that though they worked as hard as they could to bury remains quickly, decomposition was inevitable in the June weather. Trailers used to carry the dead became unwelcome sights. Still, troops continued their work and established 8 cemeteries in the area by June 10th. A little more than a month after D-Day, these sites contained the remains of more than 30,000 individuals. As troops moved on from the beaches of Normandy and into northern France, thousands of the dead were left behind, but they weren't going to stay there for very long. Soon, the Quartermaster Graves Registration Service moved in. As per the U.S. Army, burial practices for fallen service members in the earliest conflicts of the nation were haphazard at best. It wasn't until 1862 that a national cemetery system was authorized by Congress, and a further 3 decades before an organized burial and registration procedure was established by the Army's Quartermaster Department. Chaplain Charles C. Pierce was behind many of these improvements, including soldiers' adoption of identification badges, more commonly known as dog tags. These would often prove helpful when it came to identifying the dead at Normandy.
Dog tag. One I really want to count, sir. God covered a lot of bodies, sir.
By the time members of graves registration companies arrived in France, they had already undergone extensive training, from observing an autopsy to organizing mock burial grounds. Still, few were prepared for the trauma of collecting and burying so many remains, even if prisoners of war and civilians were also tasked with the hard labor of digging the graves. Further into Europe, graves registration representatives would also have to seek out the resting places of soldiers who had died in combat zones in order to rebury their remains, inventory anything found with the individual, and mark the spot for future reference. When it came to identifying the remains on the beaches of D-Day, it was sometimes as simple as looking for the dog tags worn around someone's neck. For remains found with identification tags, the standard practice was to bury the remains with one tag, while sending the duplicate back for registration purposes. However, the chaos and bloodshed of D-Day did not always mean that bodies would be found with dog tags conveniently spelling out the deceased name and company. Instead, some were forced to dig deeper in order to connect a body with an identity and a family back home. Graves registration personnel could also look through a deceased's personal effects, which might include driver's licenses, letters, and even clothing. They might also turn to fingerprints and dental records to make a positive identification. Dealing with the sheer number of dead after D-Day, as well as confronting the violent nature of their ends, proved to be an intense experience for graves registration soldiers. Their work was not a simple task of collecting all the bodies on the beach. They also had to seek out any remains still in the water. These included those caught in beached or partly submerged craft, which meant that surviving soldiers were obliged to dive beneath the water to collect the remains for proper burial. One man, Private John D. Little, said that his experience freeing remains entangled in propellers was especially traumatic, ranking amongst the worst of his life. The intensity of the work was compounded by other hazards. Soldiers had inconsistent access to bathing facilities or fresh laundry, meaning that they often had to keep working with blood on their uniforms. Retreating Germans also booby-trapped bodies, a practice documented by soldiers in other regions during the war. However, many of the soldiers tasked with retrieving the dead realized that their trauma was necessary to spare the next wave of soldiers.
The sights and the sounds all around provide the context of hell.
Though members of the Grave Registration Service clearly put in much physical effort, they weren't the only ones taking on the backbreaking labor in the wake of D-Day. Some captured German soldiers were pushed into service as gravediggers for the temporary cemeteries established in the immediate aftermath. As HistoryNet reports, once it was clear that the graves being dug weren't meant for the prisoners themselves, they completed their work with little complaint. Some of the American soldiers directed to dig graves were from service troops, which were often comprised of black service members. Local civilians were also recruited for the task. Though the French, who were paid to dig graves, spoke little English, the task set by American service members was fairly obvious and eventually attracted a significant number of workers to dig the numerous graves. The growing number of civilians, many of whom were either too aged or infirm for active combat elsewhere, played a significant role in laying the growing number of bodies to rest in both temporary and more permanent burial grounds. Despite the best efforts of the soldiers in the grave registration companies and other Allied service members who recovered, registered, and buried the dead, some soldiers' remains were never found. As history reports, getting an exact count of D-Day fatalities is difficult in part because of the chaos of war, and the violent deaths of some military personnel meant that their remains were practically non-existent. Some of the soldiers who died on Omaha Beach or other landing sites in Normandy were carried out to sea in the surf. Others met their ends in plane crashes, as service members enacted an aerial assault meant to damage transport networks and block access reinforcements. In situations where soldiers had gone missing but no remains could be found, the US military typically waited at least a year before declaring them dead. For a variety of reasons, some soldiers' bodies remained in permanent graves in Europe, far from their hometowns. Some families may not have been emotionally ready to exhume their loved ones' remains. The Washington Post notes, however, that the US military did take care of the financial and logistical particulars of reburial for most service members killed overseas. In other cases, despite the best efforts of graves registration personnel, it was simply impossible to link an identity to a body. Today, there are 27 military cemeteries in the immediate area. They include soldiers from both Allied and Axis sides, together totaling nearly 130,000 individual graves. Perhaps the most famous of the multiple cemeteries established in the wake of D-Day is the Normandy American Cemetery, in part because it prominently features in the opening scene of Steven Spielberg's 1998 war epic Saving Private Ryan. Also known as the American Cemetery at Couville-sur-Mer, the rows of white headstones mark the resting places of 9,387 soldiers. It also contains a Garden of the Missing, with memorials for 1,557 service members who were never recovered.
I hope that at least in your eyes, I've earned what all of you have done for me.
For families who did want the dead of D-Day returned to them, the logistics of repatriation could get complicated. The military was ill-equipped to take on such a massive operation. First, no dead would be returned until the end of fighting in 1945. Further complicating matters was the fact that officials had to coordinate the repatriation of soldiers who had died across the globe, from Normandy to remote Pacific islands. Some had been recovered and recorded by graves registration personnel, but others had been buried on the battlefield by fellow soldiers or lost in remote areas. It took an act of Congress, specifically the 1946 Return of the Dead program, to set aside an initial sum of $92.5 million for such a massive, complicated project. Ultimately, it cost $164 million. Because of various delays, including a series of strikes in the steel and coal industries that delayed casket production, the first World War II dead didn't return to the United States until late 1947. By the end of the program in 1951, more than 171,000 bodies had been returned to their families.